Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight I'd like to give a sense of the international context in which language endangerment and language revival is going on around the world. A lot of Oklahoma Indian tribes are working to reestablish their languages as an ongoing part of their tribal identity. I wonder how many know that similar processes are going on all over the world and for similar reasons. So tonight I'm going to touch on a number of different languages from different continents and what's going on with them and the efforts to revive languages and how this fits with politics in many cases, which is pretty interesting. And so we're going to jump around the world a lot, and bear with me. I'm going to be quoting from quite a few tracts that relate to language revival, which I think are interesting because they echo so exactly what goes on in Oklahoma Indian language preservation. Now, let's start in Europe. When we get very narrow-mindedly looking only at the Oklahoma situation, we tend to think of European languages versus Indian languages, and that's where the conflict is. But of course, it's not that simple. Lots of European languages have gone extinct as well, and there are lots of European languages today that are on the brink of extinction, or at least very endangered, and there are strong revival movements there. In fact, some of the strongest in the world. There is something called the European Bureau for Lesser Used Languages, which is based in Dublin. They estimate that 42 million people in Europe speak minority languages. It kind of makes you rethink what's meant by a European language, as we usually use the term here in Oklahoma. Let's start with some Gaelic languages. Gaelic is a family of languages, and some of the better known languages in it are Scots Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Breton, spoken in France, and Welsh, spoken in southern England. Now, the situation with Scots Gaelic, by the way, Celtic languages were once spoken all over Europe and into Asia Minor. They were much more widely spread than I had ever known before I started reading up for this show. So their domain or habitat, so to speak, has been greatly shrunk, just in a very similar way to what's happened to a number of American Indian languages. Celtic languages were even spoken in Patagonia in Argentina and in Canada and Nova Scotia, and there's still tiny communities there apparently hanging on. But they're mostly spoken in the British Isles and northwestern France. Now, Scots Gaelic, of course, is spoken in Scotland, mostly on the islands and in the Highlands. It's definitely on the decline. It was spoken throughout Scotland until the 13th century, but there was a big decline in 1746 after the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And then with the British Empire, English became the language of commerce and prosperity, and the same kind of thing that went on here went on, where the home language was becoming less and less useful in people's practical lives. Today there are about 66,000 speakers of Scots Gaelic, which is about 1.2% of the population. But 5,000 people have been studying or have studied the language for a year or more in recent years, mostly in community classes. There is some government support for Scots Gaelic. The British Broadcasting Company, or BBC, broadcasts a language course, and in the first 3 months that it was broadcasting this course, 21,000 viewers called in wanting more information or related materials that went with the program. The British government has spent $16 million per year since 1989 on 6 hours a week of Gaelic television programming. Imagine if we had that in this country, in this state. Woo, wouldn't we have fun? There's at least one rock group and one folk ensemble which use Scots Gaelic quite predominantly, so it's out there in popular culture. Also, and this is, I think, the most important recent thing that's going on, since 1982 there have been 120 what are called play groups. They're kind of like preschools, from what I understand, which use immersion language teaching. You know I'm in favor of that. And so more than 2,000 preschoolers have gotten some fluency in Gaelic through this. And there are also 40 primary schools that now offer Gaelic education for those who want to continue past that stage. As one preservationist there has said, we have to encourage parents to teach their children Gaelic if the language is to survive. A very familiar sounding situation. There's even a Gaelic language college called, and I'm not sure how this is pronounced, it might be Mor Ostaig. It's on the Isle of Skye, which is one of the more Gaelic-speaking areas. It's kind of a business school, and they teach courses in the Gaelic language. Now let's move on to Ireland. Irish, or Irish Gaelic, is a related language, pretty closely related to Scots Gaelic. There are about 1 million people who still speak it, which is a significant, it's a large number of speakers, and yet it is still very much endangered. And there's a very strong effort there, which is very much allied with political movements to try to revive and maintain the Irish language. Now, one of the big factors in its history which caused such a decline was the earlier potato famine and the immigration from Ireland, where a lot of the rural people who still were using Irish in their daily lives moved abroad where they didn't use it anymore, or where they decided not to teach their children anymore. Of course, an awful lot of people simply died during that famine as well. Today, Sinn Féin, which is the political party, a legally recognized political party of the Irish Republican movement, is very supportive of maintenance and revival of the Irish language. Now, the Irish Republican movement, for those who may not know, it seeks one united Ireland, so it does not support the Republic of Ireland's government because it's not in keeping with the proclamation of 1916. I don't know my history here, but I've just recently read this. It wants one united Ireland, and it wants it to speak Irish, and it wants to keep a lot of the traditional heritage, or revive it. Now, they have a brochure out. I don't know if this is their latest. This one I think was from the 70s. It was lent to me by a friend. It's called Éire Nua, or New Ireland, the Social and Economic Program of Sinn Féin. And here are a few quotes from it. I just think some of them are very, very telling. They will remind you a lot of the situation of American Indian languages in that the reasoning is there as to why this language should be saved. The Constitution of Sinn Féin advocates not merely the complete overthrow of English rule in Ireland, but also the setting up of a democratic socialist republic based on the proclamation of 1916. Now, this gives you a little background. And then going on to where they talk about language in this brochure, there's a chapter on language. First of all, they say one of the primary aims of Sinn Féin is the reestablishment of the Irish language in its correct place as the principal community language of the Irish people. Sinn Féin realizes that unless this is done, complete national freedom will continue to elude the nation. Sinn Féin policy does not mean that the English language will be removed from the life of the nation, but that it will be put in its proper place as secondary to the national language. I think we have this next quote on a graphic. It says, Irish is an ancient language, and over a period in excess of 2,000 years, at least, successive generations have used it, molding and developing this particular mode of speech, so that the Irish nation possessed a distinctive mind of its own. This distinctive nationality enshrines all the spiritual and intellectual possessions and characteristics which we have and which distinguish us from other peoples. Here's another good quote, also from the Sinn Féin pamphlet. A national language is the medium of a nation's culture. By culture, we mean the total network of knowledge, belief, art, customs, feelings, and patterns of thought shared by a group of people. In short, a whole way of life, or a community designed for living. It is because the Irish language grew up with our people and was the medium of expression for our distinctive culture that it is best fitted to bring about the spiritual regeneration necessary to foster the self-reliance among our people, which is a prerequisite for the solution of our many social and economic problems. It's very interesting how the social and economic and political is all tied in with these language issues. They also say, language is one of the strongest forces affecting people, which I certainly agree with. Here, I've got a couple more quotes from Sinn Féin. Here's one. As things stand, we are losing the freedom of our minds. We are being assimilated completely at an ever-growing rate with an Anglo-American mass culture. We are rapidly becoming a degenerate provincial people with no imagination, forced imitation, second-rate and uncreative. We are selling our soul for a mess of pottage. Great phrase. We are rapidly bidding farewell to nationality. So there's a very strong connection in their mind between their nationhood and their linguistic heritage, and I think that's very much true here as well. Here's one more that I think will remind you of the situation of Oklahoma Indian languages. The Gaeltacht, that apparently means Irish-speaking areas, the Gaeltacht areas, which were already declining seriously prior to 1921, have been allowed to shrink disastrously, and many of those still remaining in these areas see little use in continuing to use the language. I think we see that here, where people who even know an Indian language just don't get around to using it. They don't quite see the point because, as I said on a previous show, there's sort of no habitat for this language. So it's like a language sitting in a zoo cage, and it doesn't get used. Some of Sinn Féin's plans, should their political message be put into effect, they would like to have exclusive use of Irish place names and use only the Irish forms of place names on signs and on maps. They'd like a national film industry in the Irish language, wider use of television for Irish production. They want Irish to be the first language in all schools. Let me show you something I have here that I think is interesting. This is a sort of a primer, I guess, a public school primer. This is used, I think, in sort of a preschool, they don't call it preschool, but approximately preschool age, where all children have to study some Irish. And so this is, I think, for about 4 to 6 year olds. It's very similar to things that are being produced for Indian languages these days. It's a little storybook, nicely illustrated, with all in the Irish language. And I think it's quite charming. I'm sorry I can't read you a bit of it, but I just thought I'd show you that such things do exist. And now let's move on to Welsh, which is also spoken in the United Kingdom, actually in this case, in the southern part of England. It has, Welsh is also a Gaelic language. It has more than 500,000 speakers. I think about 19% of Welsh people claim that they speak Welsh. Now, there's a party, it's spelled Plaidcymru. I'm going to pronounce this Plaid Cymru, but I'm not sure at all. Pardon me if it's the incorrect pronunciation. I've never studied any Gaelic languages. But Plaid Cymru was founded in 1925. It's also a political movement. It was founded to secure self-government in Wales. It rejects violence and seeks a democratic socialist state to strengthen social and economic life in the area of Wales. And it also seeks to restore the Welsh language as an important part of its program and to protect the environment. It's, for instance, for a nuclear-free Wales. It publishes 2 monthly newspapers. One is in the Welsh language and one is in the English language. And they also have a brochure which I was looking through. It calls Scotland and Wales the, quote, internal colonies of Britain. So this gives you some idea of their political orientation. It claims that the London government has been a disaster to Wales, exploiting the workers there and causing high unemployment. And here's a quote from a booklet by them. Hand in hand with economic recovery will come the restoration of our own language and cultural heritage to create a new sense of pride and self-respect in being Welsh and having a national identity of our own. Again, you see nationhood and ethnic identity very closely related to language in the minds of a lot of people, as it is here among Native Americans. Plaid Cymru believes that it is vital to restore the Welsh language to its rightful place in our national life. The Welsh language has been spoken for over 1,500 years. One of the oldest known Welsh poems was written in the south of Scotland around the year 650 AD and commemorates an attack on the Anglo-Saxon military center at Caltreth or Catterick. It had previously been the language of all of Britain south of the Forth and the Clyde. Only during the last 4 generations has a major decline set in the language. Now I have 2 quotes that I believe we have a graphic on that again will just ring so true to people who have been involved in Native American language preservation. The first one, this is from the Plaid Cymru brochure still. It says, in Wales, our government, laws, religion, poetry, politics, and daily life have all been conducted through the medium of Welsh for most of our history. If we lose it, we lose contact with a wonderfully rich heritage. Possession of the Welsh language also ensures a sense of identity with our community and greater social cohesion in an increasingly rootless world where vandalism, crime, and the breakdown of family life are all too common. Here's another quote from the same pamphlet. Plaid Cymru believes that the Welsh language can and should be restored with a major national effort and comprehensive language plan. The vast majority of Welsh people want their children to speak Welsh as well as English. As many surveys have shown, knowledge of Welsh gives them the key to their heritage, broadens their mind, flexes their abilities, and makes it easier for them to learn other new languages. These are widely known concepts of how useful it is to children to be raised bilingually, and I think these Welsh people have been consulting with some linguists. They got it right there. There are now a number of Welsh bilingual schools, so the Welsh language is being taught, but it's certainly a very small minority, and any language in the kind of political position that it's in now is certainly to be considered endangered to one degree or another. Let me just mention one last Gaelic language, and this one is spoken across the English Channel in France. It's called Breton. There are less than 1 million speakers today, but certainly up in the hundreds of thousands from what I've read. It has no official status at all. It's closely related. In fact, Breton speakers emigrated to France from the British Isles at some point in history, I believe the 5th century or somewhere around there. So it's closely related to these other Gaelic languages, and it has a similar social situation in that people are fighting for it, to get some kind of respect for their language and for their heritage. Now let's move elsewhere in Europe and talk just a moment about Catalan. Catalan is in a different family. It's a Romance language, so it's related to French, Spanish, Provençal, Italian, Portuguese. There's an area that is known today, and again, this is sort of a political point, as Catalunya, which is where the Catalan people live. It's within the geographic borders of Spain. For some time, it was not recognized by national governments there, however, so it was sort of a nation without its nationhood, officially. This is from a publication of the Casal dels Catalans in Los Angeles, which is an organization of Catalan speakers in Southern California. It says Catalan is a Mediterranean country located at the northeast corner of the Iberian Peninsula with its own language, culture, and traditions. Català, which is how you pronounce the name Catalan in the language, has 6 million speakers in Spain, France, and Andorra, which is a little country sort of between Spain and France on the eastern side, and is one of the 2 national languages of Andorra. Its self-rule was abolished in 1714 by the King of Spain. So there were 2 centuries basically of, I'm paraphrasing here and not quoting anymore, 2 centuries of repression of Catalan nationalism and of the Catalan language. Then there was a little revival in the early part of this century, and then General Franco, during his regime, beginning in the 1930s, severely repressed Catalan national identity and outlawed the Catalan language basically anywhere in public, as I understand. You couldn't teach it, speak it in public, print it, publish it in any way. Today, Catalunya is actually an autonomous unit within Spain, and there are several of these. The language is no longer repressed. It's taught in the schools. It's spoken freely, and it's undergoing somewhat of a revival. Now let's go to Israel, which is the main place where Hebrew is spoken. Hebrew is just a wonderful example of a language that was just about gone, and today is a major world, well, I don't know if you were going to call it a major world language on the level of English and Arabic and Chinese, but it is certainly the national language of a country of some large status within the world, great importance. There are about 4 million speakers of Hebrew. Now, I've been reading up some materials written by Robert Hetzron, who's a well-known Hebrew scholar. He says that Hebrew was never completely extinct, but I think, if I understand what he said correctly, it was basically dead as a spoken language. It was still used, he says it was still used in some letters and even perhaps occasionally in conversation, but apparently it wasn't an everyday pass me the salt kind of language at all for many centuries, basically from the 3rd to the 19th century. Of course, it is one of the major languages used in the Bible and in the Talmud, both of which are very important to Jewish people. So it still existed. I think it wasn't quite the status that Latin had in the Roman Catholic Church. It was a little more than that. It was used more than that, but it was not really a fully alive language for all those centuries. Then there was a movement for its revival led by a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda, who devoted his life to reviving the Hebrew language as a living language and coined a lot of new words for things that didn't exist back in the ancient Hebrew-speaking days. And this movement really picked up in Palestine shortly before the founding of Israel in 1948. Of course, today, Hebrew is the national language of Israel. I have a quote from Robert Hetzron. It's brief and a simple point, but I think it's worth making. Maybe we can show this on the graphic too. He says, the importance of Hebrew is not to be measured by the number of its speakers at any time in its history. In other words, there was a long, long period when there were few, if any, speakers of the Hebrew language, but it did not cease to be extremely important to people for religious reasons and for cultural and ethnic reasons. And I think the same can be said, of course, of many Native American languages. Now let's briefly mention Basque, which is a language spoken in northern Spain and southern France, somewhat to the west of the Catalan area, actually, but also kind of a border area language. It has about 700,000 speakers in Spain and France. Most of them are bilingual, though, in Spanish and Basque or in French and Basque. Whenever you have most of your speakers bilingual, this is the same case, by the way, with Catalan, you wonder, you have to be careful and take care of that language or it's in danger of being lost. If a bilingual parent only teaches their child one language, in a couple of generations, there goes that language. Anyway, it's an interesting language because it cannot be placed in any language family. It's what's called a language isolate. There are no other languages that have been conclusively proven to be related in any way to Basque. It's just there in Europe all by itself. And one theory is that it was probably the sole survivor of a group of languages that were spoken in Europe thousands of years ago before the Indo-European languages moved in. And Basque is also very, very tied up with political movements of Basque separatism in Spain and France. So they have, as part of their program, maintaining some status or reviving the status of the Basque language. Let me just touch real quickly on a couple of other places before I try to wrap up here. I just have a couple of other places just to mention real briefly. Guatemala. You may have heard of Rigoberta Menchú, who received the Nobel Peace Prize. She's a Quiché Maya who lives in Guatemala. Very influential politically. And in terms of political organizing, if you read her writing, you find that Mayan language is very wrapped up in all of her feeling about who she is and who her people are. Guarani, I don't know if you've heard of the language of Guarani, but it's spoken mostly in Paraguay, also a little bit in Brazil and Bolivia in South America. And it's one of two national languages of Paraguay. The national languages there are Guarani, which is an indigenous language, and the other one is Spanish. There are about 2.5 million speakers of Guarani, which is about 70% of the country. So most people in Paraguay are apparently bilingual, as I understand it. I think there are a substantial number of monolinguals that speak Guarani as well. I'm not quite sure about that. Coming now, well, let's go first to the Pacific and talk just a moment about Maori. It's a Polynesian indigenous language of New Zealand. The reference I read said that about half of the 200,000 Maoris still speak Maori. I think that may be not true anymore. I think it's really diminished a lot in recent years. But at any rate, they're important in my mind because they early on, 20 or 30 years ago, started doing immersion sessions with their elders, trying to teach more young people the Maori language, with some success from what I understand. And they were influential in meeting with Hawaiian people, which is our next stop, the Hawaiian Islands, and convincing them to do more immersion programs. We've done a couple of programs which mention the Hawaiian Punana Leo or Hawaiian language immersion programs in preschools, and they're now up into elementary and high schools. You can also take Hawaiian language at the University of Hawaii. Hawaiian is really, really, really turning things around, I think. There are lots of new fluent native speakers of Hawaiian today that didn't exist 20 years ago. Lots of children have learned it as their first language or one of their first languages in school. So I think they're really turning around the situation for Hawaiian. Also in this country, I don't think we'll have time to really mention it, but remember that in this continent, perhaps I should say, there's Canadian French and Louisiana French, also two important minority languages, also very tied up with political movements on this continent, closer to home. Now they're telling me I have about 3 minutes left, so let me try to summarize a couple of things that we've seen as we kind of whirled around the world here. There are several trends which I think apply here in Oklahoma and which we can see in all these different situations around the world as well. One is that language is closely identified with ethnic identity. People are saying this all over the world, especially in minority communities. Another is that language loss is associated with social breakdown. We talked about I read some quotes from Britain with some of the Gaelic languages where they said, if we got our language back, maybe our kids would behave better, to paraphrase it rather loosely. Thirdly, there's an idea that language will restore community self-respect and pride and even have a bearing on economic status of the people. Many people have made the point that the future of a language is with the children, and we need to remember that here too. It's interesting that language preservation is often espoused by the same people that are into preserving the environment, the integrity of the environment, and taking care of biological species. I've often made that connection between language preservation and biological preservation. And finally, people around the world are saying that their minority linguistic heritage is a treasure and that preserving their linguistic heritage is a right. And I think that's absolutely true here too. It's interesting, I think, that in so many cases you find the political alliances between language and other political issues to be very much to the left, often socialist. And I think this has to do with the fact that very often the history that leads to these kind of social situations of minority languages is a kind of colonialist history where the local, rural, lower-class people become the workers, and they have lots of workers' rights issues, and they also become the speakers of what becomes increasingly a minority language, whereas the alien language that moved in is a language of prestige in the upper classes and so forth, and is always impinging on the indigenous language. And so workers' rights and language rights become very much wrapped up together. I think that didn't happen as much in this country because Indians were more isolated from the workplace until such time as much of their language and culture had already been lost. And then because of the way lands were distributed in among various non-Indian people, Indian people were never in a clump as the workforce in a factory. There was never all Indian workforce that could get together and combine these issues of political workers' rights with language rights. It's been more of an individual survival or non-workplace community survival issue for American Indian languages. But I think there is an awful lot to be learned from just getting this perspective of what's going on with threatened languages around the world. And I think we can find a lot of reason for hope in what we find going on around the world as well. I hope so. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.